in Sapperston. Let me show you some pictures of said church. Here we go. So here we go. St Andrew's Church in Sapperton in Suffolk. The ancient church of St Andrew's is all that remains of a long lost village, which was mainly near the church to its north, where earthworks can still be seen, and with the original road running to the east. The name means the village of soap makers, and we were just speculating as to whether we should revive soap making in Sapperston as another merchandise stream for the CCT, but we'll work on that, I think. Only half a mile away is the Norman church of Honington as the crow flies, and St Andrews is approached by means of a long drive through fields and past gorse bushes. Its setting is memorable as a church in the meadows. If we can just see sort of here we go. Well, that's not actually it, obviously. So there's the church building itself. The churchyard contains several 18th century headstones with cherub faces, especially to the southwest of the church. And there's a chap called William Austin who's buried here, which is a sort of tangential link to someone very famous who's a poet, a pastoral poet called Robert Bloomfield, whose The Farmer's Boy was published in 1800 and sold 26,000 copies. He was a labourer's poet, so a sort of working class hero of the day. Unfortunately, he did very, very well, but his star faded and he actually died in poverty in the end, which was a terrible thing. This church, though, comprises of a tower, a nave and chancel of equal width and a south porch. The most visible features date from the 13th and early 14th century remodelling, with hardly any of the 15th century work usually so prominent in East Anglian churches. The core of the nave and maybe much of the chancel is Norman. Now, this was what I meant to show you before. The roofs, like many other in the area, were once thatched, as you can see in this old print. And the thatch was possibly taken away in 1847 when the church underwent some restoration. Nearby All Saints Icklingham, which is in our care as well, retains its thatched roof. One of only a handful of thatched churches that we have in our collection. They're not that common. The south porch appears to have been added in the late 14th century. In the floor of the porch are two worn 13th century stone coffin lids with traces of their foliated crosses still visible. However, the star of this porch is the stunning Norman doorway that dates to the 1100s, which is a fantastic survival and in very good condition as well. The 13th century font has a consecration cross behind it, and that sort of reveals why this is Church of the Week, because it combines with the theme of the lecture today. And you can see the remains of this here. Beside the blocked north doorway are traces of a consecration cross, and there are others in this building as well. And in the north wall of the nave is a shallowed arched recess, which I think is just about here. Remarking the burial place of an important 14th century worthy, above which are faint traces of what must have been a beautiful wallpaper. It's probably quite hard for you to see, but on my screen you can just make out the faint traces just here where my cursor is here. The figure on the left clearly has a bow and some arrows, so this may well be part of a scene showing the martyrdom of St Edmunds, who was very popular in these areas, who was put to death by the Danes in AD 870. There appears to have been another figure to the right, and then the remains of the other consecration cross. Now it's our guessing moment here, and there are no prizes, I'm afraid, but it was just, we thought this would be interesting. Can you guess what these iron rings are for? They're in the wall just beneath the east window, and I'm sure you come up with all sorts of inventive answers, but actually they're for people who tied their horses up here as they traveled to the church via horseback. But amazing church as it is. So that is today's. I'm going to wish you to the top so you can have another look at the amazing building. Today's Church of the Week is St Andrew's, Sapperston in Suffolk.
Thank you, Peter. That's a really interesting church you've chosen there for us this week. So thank you very much for telling us a bit more about that church. So everyone, we're now going into a little mini question time with our Chief Executive. So if we don't have time to ask your question this week to our Chief Executive, please do keep commenting away. If you've got any questions you want to ask us, let us know. But also you can email your questions to digital@thecct.org.uk. So Peter, the weather's starting to warm up. We're starting to see buds and shoots coming up on the trees and in the grass. So spring is around the corner. What does that mean for maintenance at our churches?
Well, we like to undertake maintenance at least twice a year on our church buildings, once in the spring and then once in the autumn after the leaf fall, to prepare them for winter. So they've been through the winter, which is a rough time for historic buildings because they're bearing the brunt of the weather, as we have as well. And it's making sure that the gutters are all clear, the downpipes are all clear, all the drainage is sorted out, and any problems that have occurred from any extreme weather conditions. So it's really, really important that we get out there and have a look as we open up for the summer, well, the spring and the summer.
And a question's already come in from the audience, Peter. What are our plans for reopening our churches?
Sorry, you have to. My internet might be a little bit unstable. Can you say that again?
Yeah. What are our plans for reopening our churches to the public?
Well, as you'll have all seen, the government has laid out a roadmap which is dependent on the virus being in retreat across the country. We tried very hard to keep our churches open where we could for individual prayer, so people were able locally to go in. April the 12th, I think, is the earliest time for community buildings to be open. And then I think we're looking up to June the 23rd, is it, to be getting our buildings, if the map goes long, they'll be open for visitors from across the country, which we hope will happen very, very soon. But these are important local buildings. We've tried to keep them open where we can for local people, and we'll try and get them open as quickly as possible. But it's down to you guys who are all watching now to get out there and visit them. Don't forget to leave a donation when you do. That would be very gratefully received. Thank you very much. But I equally can't wait to get out. I'm a frustrated church visitor in me is itching to get out and meet some of our fantastic volunteers who open these churches up for us, and to see some of these beautiful buildings.
Thanks, Peter. And I suppose a final question maybe to look at is, last night we had a fantastic virtual event celebrating our wonderful volunteers and community supporters. How can people, as well as going visiting our churches, how can they support us also?
We did have an amazing event last night. It was really, really good, with volunteers and communities from across the country joining us to share what amazing things they've been doing. And there was a whole host of events, and we also had an awards ceremony as well. But volunteers are really important, and the best way, I suppose, is have you got a CCT church near you? Have a look on our website. Also, have a look on our website, because there is a bit about getting involved. And if you click on that bit of the website, it takes you down to volunteering, and there's all sorts of information there. There are some roles which we're looking for volunteers specifically for, but do get in touch if you feel you've got something to offer. We have all sorts of opportunities, and we could always use with your skills and talents. We could always use your help, really, from opening up churches to planning massive events, and everything in between. Whatever your skills are, we'll be grateful to try and find something for you to do with us. And we couldn't exist. These buildings are for church, are for people, and it's really important that people use and love them, and we rely on volunteers to make sure that they're open.
Thank you so much, Peter. And that, everyone, brings to an end of today's Church of the Week and our brief question time. But as I said, if you've got any questions for our Chief Executive, please type away or email us at digital@thecct.org.uk, and we'll try and answer those either next week, or we'll do a blog post with lots of questions on. Now, for those who join us first time, a very warm and special welcome. We do these every week, every Thursday lunchtime, and they are always free of charge. So I'm just aware that there is at the moment a little bit of spamming going on. Please don't click any of those links. We're working already away at them. And as soon as those links go on, those accounts are blocked and we delete those links. So just don't click on anything. Just bear in mind that our lectures are always free of charge, and we don't ask for any credit card details. So if anyone says you need to give card details to watch our lectures, it's not true. If you've got any problems accessing our lectures, send us a direct message and we'll give you a direct link. Now, the easiest way for you to join our lectures going forward is to make sure that you both like and follow our CCT main Facebook page, because when you do that, Facebook will send you a direct notification for whenever we go live, and you just click that notification and it brings you straight into the live stream. You don't need to search around for any links. It's a really great free tool. Now, if you enjoy these lectures, which I know a lot of you do, there are a couple of ways you can support us. So firstly, please do share these lectures, do invite your friends and family along. But also, please do consider supporting our important work. I'm sure Peter will tell you a little bit more in a moment, but we are the national charity that protects historic redundant churches, and we have currently 356 historic churches in our care, and that number is likely to increase. So please do consider supporting us. You can text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3. You can donate completely securely through our website, but also you can join us as a member. Now, if you join us as a member, it's just £3.50 a month. And if you join us by direct debit, we'll be sending you not one, not two, but 3 amazing booklets, which are about churches in our care. Now, for example, there is this book here. So you'll get 3. You'll get one about this church. This is All Saints Cambridge. You'll get one about St. John on the Wall, Bristol, but also one about Holy Trinity, York. But each booklet is full of wonderful, wonderful colour photographs, and as well as some behind the scenes facts and stories about our churches. So if you join us by direct debit, and use the lecture code, offer code, when you go through checkout, and the code is lecture in capitals, you'll be sent 3 free copies of these booklets. Now, if you've got any questions, please do use the comment feature, but also do use the DM feature. So if you've got any problems with the stream, send me a direct message and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. But I'm going to pass you now on to our Chief Executive, Peter Hayes. He's going to tell you a little bit more about our work at the Trust, but also he's going to introduce our guest lecturer for this week. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. So welcome again, all those people who haven't joined us before. Hello to you, and welcoming all our fantastic loyal followers back again. Good to see you all here today. It seems to be a lot of spam on the feed today for some particular reason. Basically, the Church's Conservation Trust is a national charity. It was set up about 50 years ago in order to save historic places of worship that are no longer had a viable congregation for them. And over that time, we've collected a wonderful collection of 356 of those buildings. They're all very highly listed and an important collection. Now, we take on about 2 or 3 a year more. And we don't know how COVID's going to impact on the work that we do. Now, our belief is that the best thing for these buildings is for them to be cared by local community, and we've set up an infrastructure of support for those volunteers and local communities, which we're trying to demonstrate is a good way of caring for these fantastic buildings. It's really important that they are used and loved. And your contributions in terms of your time and your money to help keep these buildings going is very much appreciated. Please do join us if you can. It's great to keep that mission going, because we don't know what the impact, as I said, of COVID might be for the future. It could be that more churches, but church buildings are finding it a struggle to stay open, but we want to keep them open. Really, really important. They have the most profound relationship with the place that they are. They tell the story of absolutely everybody. And it's really important that we value this amazing cultural inheritance that we have. Now then, on to today's lecture. We are very lucky to have Professor Andrew Spicer with us, who researches the impact of the Reformation on places of worship across early modern Europe and has a particular interest in iconoclasm, church architecture, the material culture of worship and liturgical furnishings, as well as the rites of consecration and sacred space. He's a professor of early modern European history at Oxford Brookes University, and his publications include Calvinist Churches in early modern Europe, published in 2007, and he's edited volumes The Lutheran Churches in Early Modern Europe 2012 and Parish Churches in the Early Modern World. We're very lucky to have him, and I'm sure he's sort of expressed a little frustration at not being able to travel as much as he was in order to undertake his research, but we're going to take advantage of all of his knowledge and his prior travel that he's undertaken to understand a lot more about consecration crosses. So Professor Spicer, thank you so much for doing this for the Church's Conservation Trust, and we're really looking forward to hearing your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And let me just see if I can start by sharing my screen. Right. I suppose I perhaps should first of all say that I'm a Reformation historian rather than a medievalist. There are quite a few medievalists working on aspects of consecration, but I found the need to look at aspects of medieval consecration in order to understand what happens at the Reformation to churches. So the medieval parish church, it stands out in the landscape, and quite often these are the largest and quite often the only stone-built building within a particular community. And these are defined as sacred space, and there are gradations of holiness that one sees in these locations. And this sanctity increases from the churchyard to the church and then through to the chancel, because of course at the altar, because of the rite of during the Mass, with transubstantiation, Christ becomes manifest in the consecrated elements of the bread and wine in the parish Mass. And so the churchyard, the church and the altar become sacred sites through an act of consecration. And this appropriates these places for religious use and sets them apart from the secular world. And while the sanctity of the building is understood by the community, it nonetheless remains pretty much intangible to them and is largely defined in terms of access and what is deemed as acceptable forms of behaviour within these buildings. And that's then enforced by both the local clergy, but also by the church courts. The holiness of buildings can be imperilled through acts of desecration, particularly the spilling of blood or other bodily fluids. And if a building is desecrated, in these instances, the celebration of the Mass is suspended, the interment of the dead within the churchyard ceases until the building can be reconciled by a bishop. There is, however, in these buildings one constant reminder, a visual reminder of the rite of consecration that has set this building apart from the rest of the world. And this is a series of crosses which are anointed by bishops during this rite. Quite often, the consecration of a church will have taken place much earlier than living memory, the living memory of the congregation. But the crosses on the internal and also external walls symbolize this rite and therefore point out to the community that this is a holy site. Now, this understanding of the sanctity of building is something that is rejected at the Reformation. The Reformers do not accept that a ritual of consecration makes a church the site of a church more sacred than anywhere else. And in fact, they denounce the whole ritual itself as being superstitious and lucrative. And so when a new Protestant rite emerges in the 17th century, and it's not actually officially adopted in England until the 18th century, and I have an article coming out on that later this year, when this new Protestant rite of consecration comes into being, it doesn't include various aspects of the Catholic ritual, which included the asperging of the building and also anointing of the church walls. So consecration crosses therefore exist and survive as relics of the sanctity of these medieval churches. Now, although there are some common features of these consecration crosses, their appearance and artistic form can vary from one church to another. Some crosses are carved in stone, while others are incised in plaster or carved into stone. Many others are quite much simpler and just painted. In fact, probably the majority of them are painted. The crosses can vary in size, and some can be particularly elaborate and decorative, while others can be very plain and simple in their form. So consecration crosses therefore not only commemorate the ritual sanctification of the church, but perhaps could also be considered as, in a very small form, distinctive pieces of religious art. Now, this is a topic that did attract attention during the 19th and early 20th century, with a series of short notices and articles relating to consecration crosses in particular churches or counties that were published in local antiquarian or archaeological journals. And these accounts generally focused on providing a brief description of these consecration crosses and their location. An article published by John Henry Middleton in 1885, for example, looked at some 30 consecration crosses and tried to suggest ways in which these could be classified. A number of surviving crosses were examined in several articles by Edward Samuel de Wick, a London clergyman and liturgical scholar. And both de Wick's notes, photographs and rubbings of consecration crosses that he used for his articles, as well as those of somebody else who writes on ecclesiastical furnishing, Francis Eales, his notes on consecration crosses, both of these sources were deposited at the Society of Antiquaries in London during the 1960s. And so Middleton and de Wick's articles have become really the principal sources for later studies of consecration crosses in medieval England. But in recent years, there's been more interest and research into sacred space, and that's concentrated much more on the delineation and the creation of sacred space, thinking about the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between the religious and the secular. And there have also been studies that have looked at how that sanctity can be threatened or destroyed through things like iconoclasm, particularly in association with the Reformation, but also with the reconceptualization of the understanding of buildings in the early modern period. Now, in this context, consecration crosses have not really received much attention. And even within the broader field of material culture and early modern religion, they haven't been studied in any real depth. They've been looked at by some architectural historians. They have, for example, been noted in the inventories published by the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments, but they don't, for example, appear in Pevsner's Buildings of England series. Art historians have looked at them, but generally in the wider context of the iconography and schematic studies of medieval wall paintings. So there's not been any real attempt to look at consecration crosses per se, in spite of this renewed historical interest in sacred space. And what I intend to do in this paper is to consider the artistic form and significance of consecration crosses, but particularly to think about them in relation to church rituals and traditions. And so I'm also going to draw, like others, upon de Wick and Middleton's research, but all the illustrations that you will find on the slides during this lecture are pictures that I've taken myself. So it's also based on some field work in this particular, on this particular topic. Although there are examples of consecration crosses on the continent, most of, well, the entire lecture is going to be focusing on the situation in England. So to think a little about the ritual of consecration to start with and how it relates to these crosses. During the Middle Ages, there was a complex ritual of consecration which had developed and included various ceremonies that were intended to purify the new church and sanctify it for religious use. And this included the purification of the building through using hyssop branches to asperge, so to scatter water both on the holy water on both the internal and external walls. The symbolic taking possession of the church building by the bishop, knocking 3 times on the door and entering the building alone. Prayers and litanies for the sanctification of the church, the abecedarium, or the writing of Greek and Latin alphabets in ashes in 2 diagonal lines across the floor of the building, the consecration of the altar, and the burial of relics or enclosing relics within the altar itself, and the anointing of walls with chrism. And finally, the celebration of the Mass. Now, there are a number of variants on this rite, but by the late 13th century, the service compiled by the papal administrator and liturgist Guillaume Durand, who's Bishop of Mende, from early sacramentals and pontificals, came to be recognized as really the authoritative form of consecration. And a revised version of this is published in 1485 as the Liber Pontificalis. And basically, after the Council of Trent, when the Catholic Church has decided its measures for revitalizing Catholicism in the mid-16th century, various things are handed over to the Pope to finish off, one of which is the Breviary, and then also the Pontificale Romanum, which is the offices that are conducted by bishops. And so the Pontificale Romanum is essentially a repetition of this earlier medieval rite, and it's enjoined upon the whole Catholic Church by Pope Clement VIII in 1596, establishing a single form of ceremonies for the use of bishops. Now, De Wick looked at a number of English pontificals and came to the conclusion that there were some differences in the forms of rites used in England and on the continent. One of the things he concluded was that from English pontificals, the bishop is required to anoint both the internal walls with chrism in 12 places, but also to anoint the external walls. And in the 14th or early 15th century Pontifical of London, it records two forms of consecrating churches, one according to Roman use and the other according to the English Church. Now, by this date, the rites had evolved from the simple of anointing of walls to the painting of consecration crosses before this takes place. Now, English pontificals stipulated that 12 equally spaced crosses were to be painted onto the internal walls and a similar number on external walls of the church buildings. And these were then to be anointed by the bishop with chrism and then censed using obviously the censer and incense. And the London Pontifical states that these crosses are to be painted in red, and each was to have an iron branch for a candle beneath it. By the 16th century, the Roman Pontifical required the crosses to be painted at a height of 7.5 foot off the ground. And you see in some illustrations from pontificals images of bishops climbing a ladder in order to reach the consecration cross to anoint it with holy oil. Surviving consecration crosses indicate that liturgical practice conformed to, surviving consecration crosses indicate that liturgical practice broadly conformed to the ordinances specified in the pontificals. And antiquarian accounts and surviving examples provide insights into the form and pattern of these of the external crosses. There's evidence to suggest that these were sometimes painted on the outside walls. So, for example, in the 19th century, a Norfolk antiquarian noted that there were 12 patches of plaster on the external walls of Newton St. Faith's Church, and apparently still some traces of colour there. There was similar instance at Shottersham, and Middleton noted that at North Reps, also in Norfolk, there were patches of stucco on the wall, and the wall was otherwise a wall of roughly cut flint, so distinctive stucco patches. And there were 12 of these patches, each of them 4 foot square, with the suggestion that consecration crosses would have been painted onto them. So such simple external crosses were probably commonplace, but in many cases, such as at North Reps, have been lost through church restoration. So if we look at the example of Holbrook Church in Suffolk, you can see underneath the east window here, 3 slightly different coloured patches against the rendering. And you will see on the right-hand side, the sign, what seems to be the remains of a consecration cross. So these patches presumably would have been painted originally. So we have the sort of traces of the external crosses at Holbrook and one or two examples still within the church itself, although others have since been covered by a notice board. There are other examples of external consecration crosses which have been carved or incised examples. Here in the Valley of the White Horse in South Oxfordshire at Uffington, there are 11 of the 12 roundels with traces of consecration crosses. And if you look at the ends of the church, you'll see at the east end, you can make out 3 roundels. At the end of a transept, you can see another roundel beneath the window. And also along the side of the choir wall next to the door, you can see another roundel there. So what these are instances that seem to suggest that there were both painted as well as carved or incised consecration crosses. And there are other places where this is also the case, which I'm going to come on to, such as Yetminster in Dorset. There are comparatively few complete sets of internal consecration crosses. At Throcking, Hertfordshire, 12 painted internal crosses were discovered and recorded in the early 20th century, but then were subsequently concealed. And the 12 crosses were unevenly distributed across the north and south walls of the church, and their heights varied from between 3 foot 2 inches and 6 foot 9 inches. And the lowest cross was located in the chancel. And a similar distinction in height can be seen here between 2 examples of surviving consecration crosses at Inglesham Church. So you have one here on the wall of the choir, and you might just be able to make out on the back wall at the east end a further example, and they're at different heights. And part of the reason why they were at different heights, well, part of the reason why they were supposed to be at 7.5 foot high was that people couldn't rub up against them. So quite possibly the idea of them being at a lower height in the chancel might be that this isn't going to be necessarily an area where people have access to. But there again, people wouldn't really have had access to a chancel anyway. The arrangement and height of several consecration crosses in Henry VII's chapel at Westminster accorded more closely with the rubrics. And De Wick identified 9 crosses, 3 of similar size, both on the south and north aisle walls, and 3 larger crosses on the west wall. And he found traces of 2 other crosses at the east end of the 2 aisles. And these aisle crosses in height were at 8 foot. From the floor, so roughly in line with the Roman pontifical. Today, only the repainted west wall crosses remain, although there are traces of the small aisle crosses suggested by holes in the masonry beneath modern wall lightings, which may, because of their positioning, may possibly be where the smaller original crosses were. This difference in height, or the requirement to have consecration crosses at a certain height, is also indicated at Exeter Cathedral, where there's an example of an unfinished consecration cross cut in the wall of the south aisle with a completed cross above it, suggesting that perhaps the lower cross was abandoned because it wasn't at the requisite height for a consecration cross. So in many cases, in many churches, the number of extant crosses are too few to get a clear sense of how they were distributed around the church or whether or not they were placed at the requisite height. To just briefly comment on the symbolism of these crosses, according to Durand in his Rationale Divinorum Officiorum, which he composed in 1286, but was widely spread in manuscript, circulated in manuscript and then published in the 15th century. Durand commented that crosses are painted in the first place to terrify demons, so that when the demons have been expelled from there, i.e. the church, by seeing the sign of the cross, they will be terrified and not presume to return there. In the second place, they are signs of triumph, for the crosses are the battle standards of Christ and the signs of his triumph. It is right, therefore, that crosses be painted there to show that this place is subject to the dominion of Christ. Thirdly, they reflect on the passion of Christ, in which he himself consecrated his church, and that faith in the passion will be implanted in their memory. Discussion of the symbolism of consecration crosses is also incorporated into another popular work, the largely hagiographical Golden Legend, which asserts that painted crosses are painted to show that the place is divine and subject to God, and that before the crosses themselves lights should be placed to represent the 12 apostles, which by their faith of God crucified and then illuminated all the world. The crosses were also important, therefore, as tangible reminders of past consecration. And the anniversary of a church's consecration or dedication was an important feast within the parish's liturgical year. And some English pontificals instruct the bishops to remind the congregation at the time of the rite to mark the date so that the anniversary can be kept as a special feast. And in some dioceses, the date of consecration or dedication is actually recorded in the church, and it's associated with parish pardons, so remission of sins through indulgences for those who attend these anniversary services. And so therefore the consecration rite has this sort of added significance in making the place sacred, but then the reminder and renewal of the through feasts of reminding the congregation of this rite, therefore reinforces the sanctification of this building each year. In the Golden Legend, it talks about the dedication of a church is solemnly hallowed among the other feasts of the church, because it is a double church or temple, that is, to wit, both material and spiritual. And the liturgy for the occasion reminded the faithful that this is the house of God, this is the gate of heaven. And John Merck, his collection of medieval sermons, included one for the Feast of Dedication, which called the congregation to come to church to worship God, having in mind the causes why the church is hallowed. One for the church cleansing, and for devout praying, and for the dead burying. Now, De Wick argues that perhaps in England this isn't necessarily the case, that lights were used on these occasions in front of consecration crosses. And his evidence for this is that he can't find references to this in English liturgical works, nor in expenditure on wax in churchwardens' account books. But I think that it seems likely that De Wick may well have been mistaken in this assertion, and it's certainly questioned by other historians and archaeologists such as Tristram, because sometimes there is evidence beneath consecration crosses of holes that may have been used originally to hold a sconce or a bracket for a light. So we have the example here of Eddington, the external consecration cross, which I'm going to talk more about the form of later. But you can see below the roundel there is a hole which may well have been used holding a branch to a candle, and then the later version of this sort of late 19th, 20th century example of what the medieval example may have looked like here. And also the example here at Shipton, you can see a different type of cross here, but with much later brackets underneath some of these crosses to hold candles. And in some cases, for example, if you go to Ottery St Mary, you can actually see parts of the iron stumps of these former lamp brackets protruding beneath these crosses. So while these candles would have been lit before the consecration crosses during the actual ritual, it seems surprising if they were not actually used on other occasions. And in fact, at Hessett in Suffolk, there are records that the area around the church consecration cross actually shows evidence of scorched marks, suggesting that this was used more than once. And a deposition made to the consistory court in Wells in 1528 by the churchwardens of Carhampton complained that there were no crosses before which candles could be lit on the Feast of Dedication. So although this is fragmentary evidence, it seems as if these were still used as part of the annual Feasts of Dedication, reminding the parishioners of the sanctity of the building. Now, one of the difficulties of looking at consecration crosses is that so many of them have disappeared in the period since the Reformation. Quite simply, the whitewashing of wall paintings means that a number of them have disappeared. But also in East Anglia, William Dowsing's tour of churches throwing down crosses and crucifixes may also have taken its toll. If you read his diary with its catalogue of destruction, there are one or two instances where maybe what he refers to is a consecration cross, but he doesn't talk about it in those terms. So, for example, often Dowsing talks about some crosses on the outside of the church and chancel, and we gave order to deface them. At Darmsden, he found 3 crosses in the chancel on the wall. So these may be consecration crosses that are defaced. So there's been, therefore, some study by De Wick and others looking at consecration crosses. But I think there are sort of also words of caution that we need in looking at consecration crosses and identifying them within churches. Matthew Champion, in his book on graffiti, refers to De Wick and also points out the risk of certain decorations or within churches, or sorry, in Champion's case, talking particularly about graffiti and his sort of extensive studies of graffiti, showing sort of decorative roundels created within churches graffiti, which aren't consecration crosses, and so possible confusion there. And to give you another example of a decorative instance where we have something which Middleton identifies as possibly a consecration cross. So you can see this sort of quadrifoil in flint. And if you look at the frieze at the bottom of the east window here, you can see either side or either end of the frieze, there is this quadrifoil decoration. But the same decoration is used on the side at the bottom of a buttress. So it raises questions as to whether or not this is use a consecration cross. Probably not, although that blank central slab in the center of the frieze may well have been initially used as a consecration cross. So to move on to something about the artistic form of these crosses and to think a little more about what they look like. Some crosses are not, in spite of the instruction in the Pontifical for them to be painted red, some of them not. Some of them are in fact painted other colours. We see some that are green and ochre and different forms. And the most common and simplest form of cross was incised in plaster using a compass to form a cross pate, where the arms at the centre of the cross are narrow and wide at the end, such as can be seen at this example, again going back to Inglesham, and in a number of other churches. In his attempt to classify these, this is what Middleton described as type A, but there are a number of variations within this of types of cross. A second type of artistic cross can be identified again within a circle, but much simpler, in which the arms are all of the same thickness. We can see examples of this at Herringfleet in Suffolk and also an example here in Iffley in Oxfordshire. But lockdown meant I wasn't entirely sure I'd be able to get in the church if I walked across the town to have a look. But you'll see some examples if you look at the Iffley Church website. Besides these crosses themselves, the roundels could be further embellished with decorative garlands. So at Carlton Road in Norfolk, this takes the form of a stylistic chain of interwoven circles. At Westfall in Suffolk, the simple cross with a crude trefoil termini has an ochre circle from which shoot off sprigs with leaves and flowers of the same colour. But much more impressive is the example from Bale in Norfolk, here, where you can see this large consecration cross behind the pulpit. And here you can see a plainer one, but also the elaborate garlands and swirling around this particular example. So these elaborate forms would seem to challenge De Wick's argument that consecration crosses are quite simple in their form. But there is a question of how they relate to other wall paintings and whether or not some of these are sort of lost in the church interior. So to give you an example again from Norfolk of Thornham Parva, where the painting, which I'm sorry is very faint here, but you can see a large wheel in the top corner of this medieval wall painting. And this is depicting the transfer of the body of St. Edmund to bury St. Edmund. But you see below the frieze, the consecration cross. So a distinction being made in terms of the wall paintings and inclusion of the consecration cross. And again, going back to the east end of Inglesham, where you can see the consecration cross is painted on the wall painting and decoration. So that this superimposing means that this is not something that is lost by the medieval decoration of the church with wall paintings. And so that these consecration crosses can be therefore included into this more elaborate formation. Besides these consecration crosses, painted crosses, we also see carved examples. So Yetminster, I'm afraid this was January, you'll see some, so it's quite dark outside. So you see this example at Yetminster where you can see the carving has been cut across several courses of the stonework of the church, and there are 11 crosses around the outside of this particular building. But there are other examples, variations. So, for example, this one at Chedzoy. So you can see here, again, a much more simple form in terms of the structure, in terms of, you've got narrow arms, but then you have sort of roses at the end of each of these finials for this consecration cross. And so in comparison with Yetminster, where you see it carved into the masonry, here you've got a separate stone. And if you look at the sort of structure of this building, you can see how, the consecration stone is very different from the rest of the building itself. And another example here at Moorlinch, also in the same part of the country, where again you've got a trefoil, but a single stone that's been carved with this decoration. If we look at Cannington, you can see probably beneath the memorials at the east end, you can probably make out the crosses here and underneath some of the windows. Here they have gone to using these in much more extensively. So they've got these carved square stones. There is no roundel in which the cross is located. And there are a number of these crosses around the building. So there are 17 of these chunky crosses. So that far exceeds the required number of 12 for reasons which are not entirely clear. The simple cross form, though, is not, there are more complicated versions. So at Ottery St. Mary, again, if you look underneath the east window, you can see the roundels. And at Ottery St. Mary, which is rebuilt by Bishop Grandison of Exeter in 1337, the roundels are carved into stone panels, and there are badly eroded figures, but you can see from the example here, we have angels carrying crosses. There are no fewer than 13 on the exterior of the church here, and a further 6 inside, although these internal ones are heavily restored by William Butterfield. And at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, again, if you look beneath the second bay from the left, you can see the consecration cross there. the Rose en Soleil image or badge of Edward VI with a crown above it, again with a cross in the center of it, which is sort of combining consecration cross with royal iconography. There is some question as to whether or not this is actually a consecration cross or not, or just royal badging. And certainly there is no evidence of a bracket that could have been held beneath, located beneath this. So what we're seeing then is sort of variations on a form, and a further variation we can see at Salisbury Cathedral. And these are crosses that have been studied in quite some depth in terms of how these are installed by Tim Tatton Brown. And this variation shows that these were originally brass indents into the stone, and you can still see in one or two cases the lead that held them in place. And there are 9 external crosses that can be seen at Salisbury. And further examples of this type can be seen at Uffington, and there is a connection between Uffington and Salisbury, and here there are 11 of these external discs from the mid-13th century. And also at Eddington, the Priory Church at Eddington, consecrated by Bishop Wyville of Salisbury in 1361. So instead of having a roundel, you can see in the later version, you've got indents with attached to the wall for these crosses. So most of these internal crosses have been restored at Eddington in the late 19th and 20th century as memorials with brackets holding the leaf lights beneath them. But we can see a number of variations of these types of consecration crosses, not necessarily in situ. So if we, here in Oxford, if you go to the Church of St. Michael in the North Gates, the consecration cross has been reused in the construction of the South Aisle. Here at Upper Eldon in Hampshire, we can see what is described as a squint at the west end, but quite clearly there's a stone reused there, which has been originally a consecration cross. But as the building had gone through multiple purposes and had served as a cowshed at some point, one understands that obviously there are alterations in the building. So to come to some concluding remarks, new approaches towards understanding church interiors and devotional practices offer the potential for a better understanding of how crosses are understood by members of the congregation. Although they could be decorative in form, consecration crosses were reminders of the ritual that in the past transferred the church into church building into the possession of the church, the institution, and the way in which this building was sanctified as a place of worship through the bishop anointing these church walls with holy oil. So recent research by archaeologists into decoration and appearance of medieval churches suggests ways that we might be able to gain insights into how these crosses are regarded by churchgoers. Drawing on medieval understandings of sight and vision, Kate Giles has called for a reconsideration of the role of wall paintings in devotional life of parish churches. Medieval treatises considered seeing as being akin to touching, and that the object of attention radiated a light back to the viewer. Further, visual mnemonics was seen as an important aspect of the art of memory in the late medieval period. Wall paintings were therefore more than ecclesiastical decoration. Their role in late medieval devotional practice needs to be reassessed in relation to the period's understanding of sight and vision. And this is taken a step further by Pamela Graves, who argues that the concept of sensory environment should be particularly useful when it comes to analysing from a more anthropological sense the relationship between the physical form and decoration of churches and the religious practices that took place in them. So what I hope I've done in this paper is to show that consecration crosses provide a way in which we can understand how medieval people recognized the sanctity of these buildings. And although studying these buildings studying these consecration crosses is fraught with challenges, nonetheless, I think these are important. It's important to recognize that these consecration crosses were important visual and artistic reminders of this earlier religious ritual. They visually defined and demarcated the church as a sacred space. And as a shaft of sunlight caught the brass indents of a consecration cross, say at Salisbury, or perhaps the candle flickered beneath another form, the church's sanctity and the holiness of the building literally shone out in the surrounding landscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm just going to stop your screen share there before we go into question time. Honestly, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I said at the start of this lecture, I didn't know much about consecration crosses, and I was looking forward to learning a lot, and I certainly have. So thank you so much. And thank you for those wonderful images of Inglesham. Inglesham's one of the churches in our care, the Church's Conservation Trust, and it's a church I haven't yet been able to go and visit. So it's definitely going onto my church crawling list as soon as we're able to do so. So everyone, we're about to go into question time. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, now's the time to ask our guest lecturer your questions. So just use that comment feature on Facebook, and I'll do my best to get as many of those questions over to Andrew as we can. Now, before we go into question time, just a reminder everyone that these lectures are always free of charge. We don't charge fee for them. So if you do enjoy them, please do invite your friends along, do share them, but please do consider making a donation to help us care for the historic churches in our care and protection. So you can do that, as I said at the start, by donating via text messaging. So you can text CCT to 70331. You can donate any amount securely through our website, which is visitchurch.org.uk, or you can become a member with us from just £3.50 a month. And if you join us by direct debit for £3.50 a month and use the code lecture in capitals on our website, we will send you 3 free booklets about 3 Pacific churches. So you'll get Cambridge All Saints, Holy Trinity York, and St John on the Wall, Bristol. And they're really wonderful books with some great facts and figures and beautiful images in there. But we're going to dive into question time now. Andrew, one question that's come in: do you know what the earliest known consecration cross at a church is in the UK?
Simple answer is no. But I mean, the rite goes well back. I mean, into the early. I mean, not in England, but I mean, it goes back to the very early stages of the church. I mean, there are aspects of the rite that date back to the 8th century, so it's an early ritual. But I couldn't give you the earliest date.
And jumping to sort of today, are consecrations still used in newly constructed churches?
Not in Anglican ones, but you still see them in Catholic churches. And one of the things is that when an Anglican rite of consecration is introduced, it doesn't involve anything to do with crosses or anointing anything. But you still see them in a Catholic context.
Thanks, Andrew. And I suppose one slightly linked to that is, were sometimes the consecration crosses, as well as obviously remaining consecrations in the medieval parish church, did they also serve a secondary purpose as being stations of the cross, or were they completely separate?
I think they're probably completely separate. I mean, people still have meditative ways of moving around spaces in the way of stations of the cross, but they probably would not have used consecration crosses in the same way, partly because they wouldn't have had access to all of the areas. So there's usually 3 on the east end at the high altar. Now, normally people wouldn't have access to that part of the church. It would only be the priests who would normally be allowed in beyond the rood screen. So although there are meditative routes of the cross, they wouldn't be using them for that purpose particularly.
And when, so we know a lot of our churches and cathedrals, they've had lots of additions over the centuries and bits and pieces bolted onto them. When a new, say a new nave aisle was adding onto a church, were new consecration crosses put in? And also, did it mean that the whole church had to be reconsecrated again, or was it just that section?
No, you wouldn't. This is an argument that theoretically, once somewhere has been consecrated, it should never need to be reconsecrated again, because no matter the line of argument is that no matter how awful whatever mankind might do, or the actions of mankind might be towards a particular building, that sanctity established, it cannot be undone. So there is therefore a distinction between reconciling and consecration. So reconciling is where the bishop conducts a service and re-establishes a place for worship. But the argument is even in that the sanctity of a building cannot be destroyed by mankind. So therefore, even if you extended a building, you wouldn't need to reconsecrate it at all. And so there are places where that sanctity is used, particularly in relation to, not to do with crosses, but to do with graveyards. So for example, the Catholic graveyard in Winchester, and also the Harkirk in Lancashire. In both cases, the argument is that these are still sacred spaces because they had been consecrated in the past. And so therefore that sanctity existed even though the knowledge of the church had disappeared subsequently.
Fascinating. Thank you for that answer. And there's been a couple of questions here, so I'm going to merge this in. But how do these crosses differ to Templar cross markings? And is there any relationship between the two?
Well, the Templars are later for a start, because the order, establishing of the order post the establishing of Kingdom of Jerusalem. But yes, I mean, obviously there's a similarity in the marking, but I think that's really about as far as the association goes. They are both taking the sign of the cross.
Thanks, Andrew. And someone's asked the question here, and I think you kind of did touch it throughout your PowerPoint, but were these consecration crosses placed only at the east end of the rood screen, and were there crosses on the uprights of entrance doorways, as Pugin suggested in his artwork?
There are instances. So, for example, at Yetminster, there is a cross in the arch of the west door, which stylistically is the same style of the consecration crosses around the outside of the building. So that might suggest that this was an instance where they have sort of run out of space. If you want to equally space 3 crosses at the west end of the building and you've got a door in the way, including it within the sort of archway, that might be one way of doing it. So usually they are equally spaced at the east end and equally spaced at the west end. But the inclusion at Yetminster suggests that maybe they can be included within the fabric. And the one at Yetminster is smaller over the door compared to the other crosses.
Thanks, Andrew. And again, we're going slightly back into looking at, when we talked about consecration and sort of, adding on parts. But someone's asked an interesting question here about if they were, it's a kind of a dual question, but firstly, would a large cathedral have the same number of crosses as a small parish church? And secondly, if that cathedral is part of a monastic precinct that had separate chapels, would each chapel then be have its own consecration crosses, or would it be classed as part of the actual monastic conclave that's consecrated as a whole?
I think actually large cathedrals have the same number of crosses. That seems to be the case in Salisbury, which has the number of examples. Certain parts of the church now, for example, Westminster Abbey, which I talked about, the Henry VII Chapel seems to have its own set of consecration crosses, which presumably the rest of the Abbey would have had its own set. Where places were used for parochial use within a monastic church or a cathedral, I wouldn't have necessarily expected that to have separate crosses, quite simply because, in a sense, that area is given over by that authority for parochial use, rather than it being owned. I mean, they have possession of it through use, in a sense.
That's fascinating. And one of the earlier questions that came in, and again, you touched on this a little bit on your in your lecture, Andrew, but do all consecration crosses appear on the outside of a church? There is one built into the inside Norman tower of my local parish church, which the church has always said is a robbed Saxon burial marker. I disagree, as I believe it may have been a consecration cross.
Well, I think the evidence is that consecration crosses can be reused in various places, as I showed it up at Eldon and mentioned in Oxford example. So it may be a reuse of a stone, but yeah, I mean, theoretically, I mean, you go to some places and you look at where the distribution of what the consecration cross is, and you think, why are there some gaps? I mean, you know, it sometimes seems to be quite random. Theoretically, you should have 3 at the east end, 3 at the west end, and 3 evenly spaced on each of the R walls, but that doesn't necessarily happen. So it may well be that there is some local variant.
And the person who asked that question, please do let us know what church is your local parish church, and we'll see if we can get some answers for you, because we'd love to see that stone and sort of see if we can find out definitively. So do let us know what church it was, and we'll see what we can do. Is there an element, Andrew, that when these consecration crosses were applied to a building, was part of the purpose seen to actually protect people from evil spirits? Was there any of that associated with the consecration process?
I mean, technically the church would say no, but yeah, I mean, clearly that I think that probably is part of the understanding that this is what makes the building special and sacred and so forth. And so that you know, that's why buildings are used in this way. This is why people swear oaths at altars, and so that sort of added protection, in a sense, coming from that. And the idea that these are sort of indelible markers of sanctity, that this cannot be destroyed. So I think it's quite easy for superstitions to develop around those crosses in that sense.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we've got time for one final question. It's always a hard one to ask, and I'm going to put you on the spot, I'm afraid, but do you have a favourite church with consecration crosses?
Gosh. Well, I suppose in many ways I like Salisbury because they're so clear cut, and you can sort of see. I mean, the one thing I sort of glossed over is that the ones at Salisbury, if you are going to have brass inlays, you are going to actually have spent a lot of time preparing those stones in order to actually make that work. So I suppose Salisbury in many ways, but also Ottery. I mean, those are just lovely examples at Ottery St Mary.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for your time today. Now, everyone, before I introduce, to tell you a bit more about next week's lecture, last night, as we said at the start of our talk with Peter earlier on, we had a fantastic evening celebrating our volunteers. Now, one of our award winners expressed one of the things he looks forward to each week is seeing certain guests who always sits behind me, and that is Clement the Black Labrador. And as a thank you to everyone, there you go. You can see he's very happy sat behind me, and he enjoys every single Thursday lunchtime lecture. Oh, he's getting up now. There you go. So everyone, Clement the Black Labrador has said hello this week. So next week, everyone, we are going to be joined by Dr. Eleanor Parker, who's going to be talking to us about Vikings in English churches. And we've got a really fantastic example for a Church of the Week next week. So make sure you join us at 12:50 p.m. for Church of the Week. And then the lecture will start as usual at 1 p.m. But again, thank you so much, Professor Spicer. That was fantastic. And the comments have been great. And I hope everyone else has learned lots about consecration crosses too. But if you've got any other questions, anyone, please do keep commenting. We keep our eye on it. And if you've got any ideas for future lectures, send us an email to digital@thecct.org.uk or just comment away. But thank you ever so much.